Hey everyone, my name is Justin and I'm so excited to be able to look at another Bible story with you guys today. If you remember last week's video, Pastor Bill introduced someone named Paul to us. And Paul has a lot of stories about him in the book of Acts. There's just story after story about a time where Paul was being bold and courageous and sharing his faith and letting other people know about the good news and the resurrection of Jesus. And so today I have another story for us, and it has Paul in it, and this time Paul gets himself into a pretty difficult situation. But before we look at that story, I have a question for you. Has there ever been a time where you've seen a really big storm? I know I have. There have been countless times when there's been rain and wind when I looked outside my window, and one time it was so windy that my house lost power. And it was completely dark and there was thunder and lightning outside. Has something like that ever happened to you? Well, if it has or not, I want you to picture that storm in your head. I want you to picture the wind coming in and the rain coming down and thunder and lightning, and that can be a pretty scary situation, right? Alright, so as we read this story today, I want you to keep that picture in your mind and think about that's what Paul was going through during this situation, and yet during all that he trusted that God was in control. And so today's story is found towards the end of the book of Acts in Acts chapter 27. And when we first open up this story, we see that Paul and Luke are on a boat together. You may know who Luke is. He wrote a couple books in the Bible. He wrote the book of Luke, which you might have heard about, and he also wrote Acts, which is the book that we're studying together. And so Luke is recording what has happened here, and he's on the boat with Paul. And Paul and Luke, as they're on this boat, they're actually prisoners because people didn't like the way they talked about Jesus, and people didn't like what they were sharing. So they were on this boat headed towards Rome as prisoners. And when they were on this boat, they started to notice that some things weren't quite right. They noticed that the wind really started to pick up, and so they decided to let the Centurion know what was going on. A Centurion is a Roman soldier, and this is the guy that was in charge of the boat. And so Paul and Luke, they noticed the wind, but unfortunately for them, they weren't in charge of where the boat was going. The boat was in charge by the Centurion, and there were a bunch of other people on the boat that Paul had to convince. And I don't know what kind of boat you're picturing right now, but the boat in this story held 276 people. We find that out at the end of the chapter, that this boat was huge. There were 276 people on board. And so what Paul has to do is he has to convince them that they're in danger because he sees the wind starting to pick up. And this is what Paul says in Acts chapter 27, verses 10 and 11. Paul says, "I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well." But the officer in charge of the prisoners, the Centurion, listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. They didn't listen to what Paul was trying to warn them about, and who wants to guess what happens next? Yep, they got in some big trouble, and everyone on board started to freak out, and there was a lot of chaos. They started throwing cargo over the side of the boat because they wanted to stay afloat. And the wind and rains came down, and all of a sudden they were right in the middle of the storm. But even though they were in the middle of that storm, Paul still had some encouragement to share with the people on board. This is what Paul says, still in Acts chapter 27, but here's what he says in verses 22 through 25. "But take courage, none of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said.'" And so even in the middle of an extremely scary and extremely dangerous situation, Paul took the time to encourage everyone else on board of the boat. You see, the night before, Paul received a message from an angel sent from God. And this message was that everyone on the ship would be protected. God was going to protect each and every single one of them, even though the ship would go down. And so Paul, he goes back to everyone else on board and tells them to take courage. Don't be afraid of what's going to happen, but instead God is going to protect them. And so Paul encouraged everyone else with this message. But the story, it doesn't stop there. We see that the boat runs into some more trouble. There were some rocks up ahead on the coast of land, and they were getting awfully close to the rocks. And once again, everyone on board was freaking out, and there was a lot more chaos. People thought that they were going to hit the rocks and that the boat was going to sink. And so once again, they started throwing things over the edge, and someone came up with this plan that they were all going to jump off and swim to shore, swim to land. And so here's the problem with that plan, though. Some of the people on board were prisoners. And so some of the people started to think, well, if we let them start swimming towards land, they might just keep going and escape from us. And so someone else came up with the idea that, hey, we should kill all the prisoners before we all try to swim to land. But as we see in the story, that idea was rejected. The captain found favor with Paul, and the captain wanted to spare Paul. And so he made sure that everyone on the ship stayed alive, and they went through with the plan. They all jumped off, and here's what it says in Acts 27:44. It says, everyone escaped safely to shore. And so that's an awesome story, right? Every single one of the people on board, all 276 people, all survived, even in the middle of that crazy, dangerous situation. And it's because they were protected by God. It's because God was in control of all that situation. And so like I said, this is such a cool story. It's something I love, and I think it's really interesting. But before we go, I have 3 points, or 3 things that we can learn from the story. And so the first thing that I learned from this story that I hope you would learn too is that God is in control in every situation. Even when the wind and waves seem like they're too much to handle, even when we're in situations where it seems like everything is going wrong and everything is just super hard for us, we can know that God is in control of those situations. So that's the first thing that I learned. The second thing I learned is that because God is in control, we can choose courage over fear. And just like Paul in the story, he chose to encourage people, and he encouraged them to be courageous in the middle of a tough situation. He remembered the promises that God had made to protect him. And so he chose to encourage people rather than be scared. And we can make the same decision in our lives today. We can choose to know that God is in control, and this causes us to be courageous rather than fearful in the middle of our situations. Finally, the third thing I learned from this story is that God has a purpose for all of us. You see, Paul was telling people about Jesus before and after this shipwreck, and Paul was protected by God because God had a very specific purpose for Paul's life, and he has a very specific purpose for our lives too. And that's to let other people know about Jesus, let people know about the good news and resurrection and all that Jesus has done for us. So we all have a purpose. Just like Paul was able to share his faith, we can share our faith too. And so I hope as you've been learning about the book of Acts with us, you understand that God uses people just like me and just like you watching this video to spread his gospel message, to spread the good news of Jesus. And so that's another thing that I learned from this story, and something that I hope you learn as well. And so thank you so much for joining us during this video. I hope you enjoyed learning about Paul and many of the stories that he has recorded in the Bible. But before we go, I have a few discussion questions for us. And the first discussion question is this: has there ever been a time where you have been scared? And how can knowing that God is in control help us overcome our fears? And finally, how can we encourage others to be courageous in difficult situations? So if you're watching this video right now with mom or dad or a brother or sister or whoever you're watching this video with, you can take time to discuss those questions and also talk about that amazing story where Paul, in the middle of a dangerous situation, trusted that God was in control and trusted that God would protect them. And God did. He came through. He protected all 276 people on board of that boat. And so thanks so much for looking at this story with me today, and I hope you had a fun time learning about it, because I know I did. So I hope to see you all very soon, and hope you have a great rest of your week.